Welcome back to the program. It's the Vicki McKenna Show. Standing by in the Homesteader Store hotline, Homesteader Store, good people with the right stuff, Kubota Ellis Tractor and Cub Cadet, is Rick Esenberg from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Good to have you, Rick. Thanks for joining me.
No, thanks for having me on.
So, is what Evers did legal? Let's start there. Let's start with the 400-year funding of education, which is cumulative, by the way, by collapsing a couple of numbers and a hyphen in the budget. Is it legal for him to do that?
Well, I would argue that it's not. And, you know, Wisconsin has had this crazy gubernatorial veto for years, which for a long time was interpreted by courts to let governors of both parties, you know, play some kind of a weird crossword puzzle game where the legislature would pass an appropriations bill and they'd cross out letters and words and parts of sentences, combine this, and they would make a whole new thing. And so we had constitutional amendments to rein that in, to stop the Vanna White veto and the Frankenstein veto. And then a couple of years ago, there was a case called Bartlett versus Evers that we brought. And we said, look, even within a sentence, you can't use this partial line on veto to change something that the legislature passed into something else. And we won that case, but the justices all disagreed on the reasons that we won, and they had different formulations. I think the four justices essentially took the position that there's some level of transformation of what the legislature has passed, which is just too much, cannot be permitted under this partial veto provision. I think Governor Evers crossed that line. I think it's ridiculous to think that an increase in the revenue limits for school districts for one single biennium could be turned into a compounding increase of these revenue limits for 400 years, basically in perpetuity. I mean, the United States hasn't even existed for 400 years. I understand that Republican governors have done, you know, ridiculous things too, but it's time to stop. This is no way to make law, and it's really contemptuous of the voters in our democracy.
That's what it was, because it's so outrageous. It was a big middle finger from the governor to everybody. And this was an agreed upon increase for the biennium. And had the legislature, instead of using the years, 2024 to 25, had they used the biennium, the phrase, the biennium, he couldn't have done it. This was an up yours. It was insulting and offensive. My concern is, because now that you've said that the legislature, or rather the Supreme Court, had different opinions on why a Vanna White style veto in the middle of a sentence is wrong, could he get away with this?
Well, you know, I mean, you know, I've been doing this a long time, and I know that you know, you never know until you get a final decision from a court. And you know, there were a couple of justices back in when Bartlett versus Evers that decided that wanted to leave the veto just the way it was. And so, you know, the composition of the court has changed a little bit. What will happen this time around? I think that, you know, what we have to keep in mind as we evaluate this is I think a lot of people are sort of, you know, joining their partisan tribes. And so you hear a lot of people on the Democratic side saying, aha, you know, the governor outsmarted the Republicans, as if this is some type of a game. That whether you can spend billions of dollars of taxpayers' money is some kind of a game, you know, where you know, the winner is, you know, the person who's the most clever. That's not what this is. And nobody should want a governor to be able to do this, because as I find myself saying all the time, there are no permanent victories in politics. And if Democrats like what Governor Evers did here, I guarantee you there's going to be a Republican governor someday, and that Republican governor will do the same thing.
It's true.
And so,
it's true, but the press won't. The press will be outraged. You're not seeing a whole. I mean, this is odd, because I'm not saying there's no coverage on it, but it's kind of flying under the radar a little bit. It's a 400-year multi-billion-dollar increase. And by the way, and thanks to Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, the analysis of just the first 10 years of this is up at your website, will-law.org. It starts with $325, and then it's $650, then it's $975, then it's $1,300, et cetera, et cetera. By the time you get to 2033 to 2034, it's $3,500 more per student forever and ever. I guess maybe we'll just never increase education spending again since we've got automatic increases.
Yeah, and it creates all sorts of problems because although this is a little bit like an entitlement, Wisconsin has to balance its budget. It can't do what the federal government does. It can't just borrow money in perpetuity at ever-expanding levels. And so, if to actually deliver on this, there's going to have to be an increase in revenue, or local school districts are going to have to raise property taxes. And so maybe this authority will go unused, but most of the time when local school districts have that power, they use it. And so, the reason that it turns out to be so much is this $325 every year, basically forever, has a compounding effect because each $325 creates a higher base for the next year, and then a higher base for the next year, and a higher base for the next year. And it whether it's good policy, whether it's bad policy, I don't know how we can possibly know what the revenue limits are, supposed to be, 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years out. But it's not the way. It's not the way a decision like this should have been made. This was never something that was proposed. It was never something that was debated. It's something that, the governor is simply trying to impose upon all of us because it turns out that, somebody in his office was more clever than somebody in the office of the GOP leadership. And I'm sorry, but, democracy isn't a contest in which the victory
it's not
goes
a gotcha
to whoever
game.
is the most clever, right?
Yeah, well, and it's an insulting because nobody and somebody emailed me today and said, well, how come the Republicans were so stupid they didn't see this coming? Because who would have thought that somebody would have been a jackass enough to take, the years 2024 to 2025 and turn it into 24-25. See, that's not literally nobody would have ever imagined someone would have been that petty and that evil to do that. And so if they'd have thought of that, they'd have put the words the biennium in instead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, hindsight is 20/20, and after something is done, it's always easy for us to point a finger and say, didn't you see that coming? But here's the thing. I don't know that I want my legislators and my legislative staff to be, who are supposed to be wrestling with some of the more difficult issues that face our government, to be spending time, trying to game out like an acrostic puzzle, a game of Scrabble, in order to, figure out who might make the next move on them. That's not productive time spent. That's game playing, and we ought not to make laws that way. And unfortunately, for too long, the courts have allowed that. We tightened it up by amendment. We tightened it up by Bartlett.
It's got to be tightened up
Beavers.
again.
Maybe we didn't tighten it up enough, but if we haven't, then we should.
We thought we did. I will say that. Back there was the Vanna White veto and the Frankenstein veto, and we dealt with them both. The Vanna White veto was dropping letters out of words and turning them into whole new concepts. And the Frankenstein veto was materially changing the meaning of sentences and policy. We thought we got rid of all this garbage, but we really didn't, because there's an enormous amount of power that still rests with the executive in Wisconsin in the budget process. So, how about we just define line item? Maybe if we had a constitutional amendment that just defined line item, for heaven's sake, because it's ridiculous. We're the ones this is getting dumped on us. All these political people can laugh about scoring one up on their political opponents, but we're the ones who have to bear the burden of this. we're the ones who are going to be coughing up $3,500 more per student. Rick, what's the amount of money already spent per student for 35% proficiency in reading and math? Somewhere around $14,000 a student. So now we're going to be close to, for heaven's sakes, pretty soon we're going to get to Ivy League university prices for 35% proficiency in reading and math.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. There's sort of this quiet assumption that all of this is for the children and all of this is to further education. And the fact of the matter is, social science is kind of a Tower of Babel. You can generally find a study to support whatever you want. But I have to say that over the last, 50 years or so, actually longer than that, I think it goes back to the Coleman report in 1966, the finding that after a certain point, spending more money doesn't really lead to better educational results is really one of the more robust findings in social science. And so this idea that we just had to spend this money, and it's so important to spend this money, that, we should turn, lawmaking into, some type of a game, I think is very, very short-sighted. In Bartlett versus Evers, I think we called it the magician's veto, where the governor would pull a rabbit out of the hat. He would turn one thing into another thing. I think that decision might apply here, but if it doesn't, I think it's time for another constitutional amendment.
Oh yes, and I hope people are already working on this, because this is again insulting. It's insulting to me. It's insulting to just random people who deserve better than that. One last thing I should point out. Now I know that there was an increase in school voucher funding in this budget, but prior to this budget, school choice schools were spending, something like 60% of the average cost spent per traditional brick and mortar K-12 school student, and getting better results. So this idea that, it's for the kids. Well, kids were being educated for a whole lot less money and not getting 35% proficiency in reading and math. So just wanted to leave with that as school choice potentially comes under attack by this court in the not too distant future. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. Take care.
Good to have you.